I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the second of a four-part Exploring Scientific Data Platform series, spotlighting one of our partners, ZONTAL. In the first session, we covered the basics around scientific data platforms with Dan D'Almeida, the Vice President of Product Management and Marketing with ZONTAL. Today, we're going to zero in on the value add of platforms. I started this series off with a few what-ifs, and I'm going to pull one of them in for today's session. What if you could respond to an IP protection court case need rapidly and with confidence? What if you had full trust in your organization's scientific data, new or old, such that the data you received in response to questions asked was fully trusted, allowing you to make decisions without questioning its integrity? Today, and through the Spotlight series with our partner ZONTAL, you will learn the value of scientific data platforms and the value they can provide your organizations beyond the laboratory. Today, we specifically zero our discussion towards how the inherent accessibility and searchability of a platform supports your intellectual property needs. My name is Lisa Richard. I'm a director here at CSOLS, responsible for strategic services, data and analytics, as well as partnerships. I'm happy to introduce you to Danielle Moore, who is a senior product manager for ZONTAL. Welcome, Danielle. We're very glad to have you here with us. In our prep for this, you mentioned several use cases, but we landed on IP protection for this discussion. Can you kick us off with why, in your view, this was a good focal use case when discussing scientific platforms?
Sure, thanks. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me. I am excited to talk about the important role that data preservation plays in the protection of intellectual property. So the pharmaceutical industry generates approximately $18 billion per year globally on patented drugs, just patented drugs, with one blockbuster drug having the potential to generate anywhere between $1 and $10 billion. So protecting these patents and the associated data is essential for sustaining revenue and funding further research and development. But it can be very costly, with the average patent litigation costing around $2.5 million. That's per litigation. That's not for a year. That's per litigation case. So in the case of patent disputes or other legal challenges, preserved data provides that robust evidence to support claims and defend intellectual property rights, which is critical for protecting investments in drug discovery and development.
When I think about it, then IP protection was the perfect use case, and I'm glad we landed on it. Experimentation's very scientific. It's very scientist specific, especially for research. I can't even imagine having to sift through even just figuring out which system, which groups to ask, which experiment pathway, and how many months that would take to sort through if I was on a legal team. Talk us through kind of the value of this use case and the use case overall that you've seen.
Sure. And I'm going to go with a case that's, kind of brief, and without naming any client names, of course.
Of course.
So kind of start with the use case of a large pharma company finds themselves preparing for patent litigation. It usually goes something like this. The IT department has to get access to the data for their legal team, or they have to try to pull every record or scientist tagged by that legal team. But the drug discovery data is not always consolidated, or it can be really hard to search, especially in legacy systems. They miss records, or they find missing signatures on closed experiments in those legacy systems. So then the company spends months checking every possible location where data is associated with a patent, like where that could be stored, trying to fill those gaps in their data integrity. In the particular case of this customer, when they approached ZONTAL and we brought all their legacy data into our platform, we found data the legacy system could not find, and we were able to pull an advanced audit trail to show that records had been signed in that legacy system, but using a third-party tool. So this is one very specific example of how we demonstrate the value of IP protection and data preservation in ZONTAL.
I mean, I can certainly see the value of that. I suppose it could expand even to product complaint response, right? Or search, or even audit response. I know you and I touched on that. Maybe you're going to touch on it later, but I think that the value that you're showing is far beyond just the legal team. You could think of many use cases that are similar, where there's a question comes in and we have to sort through and sift through without really knowing quite yet what we'll find. I want to touch on one thing you said. You mentioned that Zontal, once you ingested all the data, Zontal found data that the legacy system hadn't. I mean, that sounds kind of like a game changer. So I'm gonna ask you to circle back and just kind of dig into that a little bit for us, what you meant by that.
Yeah, sure. So I think the part of collecting data that is often overlooked, especially in the case of a legacy system or any data producer,
Mhm.
really, are things like, do you have the data? Can the right personnel find and access the data? And is that data complete? To your point, if you had some kind of complaint, this is all a paper trail.
Mhm.
So in the case of Zontal, because we are an advanced data preservation system, we were able to search and enrich the metadata in a way the legacy system and humans could not.
Okay. That's great. Seems like a little bit of a pipe dream. I do recall asking Dan in the first session if this platform was a dream or a reality. Um, Patent cases, though, could be years, if not decades, after data capture. Can you bring us deeper into this, focusing on how digital preservation ensures the IP data remains intact, even as technologies evolve, given the decades of time that can pass? And I suppose if you could weave in there a little bit data ownership and access over time, because I think the concept of future proofing, it's really hard to sort of envision that that could be a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to address that in two parts. So
Okay.
let's start with who owns the data. The best part of using Zontal to preserve your intellectual property data is that your company, that the company who created the data, the drug discovery, the research and development, owns that data. You maintain ownership.
Okay.
So if Zontal, talking about, technologies and how they evolve over time, say if Zontal were to ever become obsolete because the data is put into a vendor neutral format, it's always your data. You can continue to build off of scientific research from the past and reduce the possibility of repeating experiments and discovery work in the future or for the future. Secondly, pharma companies have policies around how long they have to keep their data, but how they keep it is often an afterthought. So, for example, a retention policy of 30 years, it could mean continuously paying for licenses of a technologically obsolete software 30 years later, when instead they could preserve the data following the FAIR data principles. And I'll touch on FAIR:
Mhm.
findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in a vendor neutral format, and then they can get rid of those legacy or obsolete systems and the costs associated with them by doing so. Um, Not to mention, legacy and obsolete software's solutions, they often run the risk of degradation or corruption or incompatibility with future operating systems. I use the case of we've all created a document 12 years, 20 years later, we try to open it, and you get that warning that there's a compatibility issue and some content may be lost. So if you have a legacy software, particularly from the pre-cloud days, or even a data archival or storage solution from those
Mhm.
pre-cloud days, when you try to open that, whatever it was that data is, you are running the risk of losing some of that data or some of the compatibility issues. So it's not something that you really want to risk, especially when you're talking about intellectual property.
And I suppose pulling in and ingesting that legacy data and decommissioning, which is the topic I think of Kelsey's talk in the next part of this series. I think the other valuable piece of it is that because the data transformation is standardized, correct me if I'm wrong, that allows those legal questions, despite spanning decades, to still be valuable, right? Because it's all being transformed to the same format. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's vendor neutral and it's human readable and it's easy because it's based on a JSON format. It's very easy to you know, transition that into any kind of new system that you incorporate in the future.
Okay. And the other piece that you touched on, and then I have another couple of questions moving forward, is that a lot of folks, we think of IP protection as a downstream thing, but that total cost of ownership concept that you brought into play, I think I'm going to bring that to the chat with Kelsey next week as well, right? In terms of not only decommissioning, but decreasing the total cost of ownership of your landscape. Okay, so the thought of digitizing and transforming this information for the legal team in order to ask questions and support cases, future-proofing the data, it can kind of seem out of reach given the technology is changing and most folks are just trying to get that base level of data set. How would you break down the way that our attendees or anyone could view this and make a business case for it, right? So instead of separating out, I want to integrate my instrumentation, I want to decommission a system, kind of folding in that data preservation and IP protection for the log haul into those business cases. And I
Yeah,
suppose
absolutely.
oops, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was just going to circle back to my FDA concept. An investigator is coming in that also, whether it's FDA or legal, that could feed into that justification as well, I would suppose.
And that's the perfect lead in because the approach that I have thought of for this is so data from inception. If you think of it this way, data from inception is IP protection.
Mm.
I was recently having this conversation with a former colleague who now works on the regulatory and compliance side of the industry. And we concluded during our chat that the data collection from the start of drug discovery or R&D or whatever your company calls it
Mm.
is IP protection. So if you think about an FDA investigator or an auditor, what they're coming in and looking for, everything is centered around the data, from proof of concept to method development to validation and testing and clinical trials. Being able to find that data that proves discovery and efficacy is a huge part of getting approved for the patent. So that's the very beginning, right? You're collecting this data from data producers, instruments, all of your ELNs, your LIMS, all of these things house your data. And if you can't pull what they're asking for, and they're asking, where is this? Where is this? How did you do this? There are so many questions they ask. And an investigator comes in for what, 2-3 days at a time, 8 hours a day asking these kinds of questions. And then they go and they write up their reports and they have suggestions. If you could consolidate all of your data into one preserved vendor neutral format, and as soon as they ask, you have the ability to search that metadata and find exactly what they're looking for. Imagine being able to send the investigator on their way in 1 or 2 days and having a perfect follow-up report. Like, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think one of the questions that we always ask is we sort of focus on the data first as well, and then we look for fit for purpose along that data stream. And one of the questions we always ask is sort of not just what questions you ask of your data in your workflow, but what questions are getting asked of you or your division that you're not easily able to answer. And I don't often think of IP protection as one of those, but I think that's an excellent addition to the business justification for these investments. Okay, I think we
Yeah,
have about a
absolutely.
minute or two left. What is the one kind of key message you would like to leave folks with to understand how scientific data platforms support IP protection needs?
Yeah, I mean, Zontal, we're addressing the need for comprehensive IP protection across scientific industries by utilizing that vendor neutral format and advanced data visualizations. So by consolidating all of your IP related information into one managed solution, you can ensure that long-term digital preservation, which I know Dan talked about last week, efficient retrieval, robust security. It protects your valuable patents and streamlines your drug discovery processes, but it also facilitates the decommissioning, as you mentioned, of those legacy data repositories. And again, I know my colleague Kelsey will talk more about that next week.
Yep.
So importantly, it's support patent litigation efforts, maintain compliance with regulatory requirements, and confidently safeguard that intellectual property.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Danielle. We really appreciate your joining. It was nice to follow on from the basics to a use case and hear how it adds value and value needed for most, if not all, life science companies. For those who've joined, we thank you for your time and we encourage you to attend the session next Wednesday, where we'll shift over to the value that a scientific data platform provides with regards to system decommissioning. Also, if you missed last week, please do request the video. Dan D'Almeida does a great job discussing Zontal's foundational aspects and value as that foundational layer. Thank you so much for your time.